Hi, this is Phil McCauley for Labour Business TV, and today I'm delighted to be welcoming Peter Kellner, the former president of YouGov, political commentator and observer of all things political on a global basis for a very long time that we've all been interested in politics. Peter, welcome to Labour Business TV. How are you?
Personally fine, politically depressed about the government, but rather more cheerful than I was 6 months ago about the Labour Party.
Entirely understandable. And speaking of the Labour Party, of course, we've had a massive transition from the end of the Corbyn era to the beginning of Starmerism. How's Keir Starmer doing from your perspective?
I think he's doing well. One can take this at two levels, and I'll come to a qualification in a minute. The first level is one only has to observe him every Wednesday at Prime Minister's Questions to see somebody who's on top of his brief, who's asking the right questions, and showing up the Prime Minister, who seems frankly incapable of giving sensible or effective answers to Keir's questions. And secondly, the polling data shows that the Labour Party is now back in the game. The last batch of polls at the end of May showed the Tories down to sort of single figure leads, to 4, 5, 6 point leads typically, whereas at the general election it was a 12-point Conservative lead, and a couple of months ago you were looking at 20 points or 25-point Conservative leads. And when you look at Keir Starmer's personal ratings, he's now challenging Johnson. A lot of people have not made up their minds about Keir Starmer, so it's not fixed yet. But if you take the net ratings, those who think well of him against those who think badly, his net score is pretty similar now to Johnson's. Corbyn was always miles behind Boris Johnson. So, you know, everything's looking up. But, and here's the but, given how shambolic the government's handling of the pandemic has been, and the public has noticed this, you know, the public does think the government messed up. It did start the lockdown too late. The government is much less trusted than it was at the beginning of the lockdown to handle the pandemic properly. Given all that, why is Labour still behind, albeit narrowly rather than heavily? And the other day there was a YouGov poll conducted at the very end of May, where they repeated a battery of questions about the Conservative Party and about the Labour Party, and asked whether people thought they were trustworthy, untrustworthy, competent, not competent, strong, weak, and so on. And what comes out of this poll? A couple of things. Firstly, the figures for the Conservatives have gone down very sharply since early April, when the same questions were last asked. And most of the Labour figures are up a bit. But just take one example, competence, probably the single most important reputational quality a party needs that's challenging for power. Is it competent or is it not competent? If it's not competent, it doesn't matter how popular its policies are, how lovable its leader is. If people think it's not competent, they're not going to vote for it. So, right. So let's look at the Conservative figures. Is it competent or not competent? Back in April, it had a net score of plus 19, 46% competent, 27 incompetent, plus 19. The Conservatives are now minus 13. Huge shift from a clearly positive rating to a clearly negative rating. Now look at Labour's figures. Back in April, shortly after, a week after Keir Starmer became party leader, minus 34. Minus 34. Terrible figures. Keir Starmer's had not really made an impact. Now, what's the figure? Minus 19. So it's gone from minus 34 to minus 19. So if you look, compare with the Tories, there was a chasm a mile wide back in April. Today, there is no longer a chasm, but the Tories are still ahead. Their competence rating, minus 13, is still a bit better than Labour's minus 19. So there is still a journey that Labour's embarked on, but it hasn't got as far as it needs to if we're going to start seeing Labour moving ahead in the polls and the Conservatives getting really rattled.
It's very interesting what you're saying. Now, competence, let's talk about that for a minute, because we've all seen the catastrophic performance of Johnson at PMQs, and it has been that, certainly, I would agree. But we've also seen the real Prime Minister, Dominic Cummings, running the show from the garden of 10 Downing Street. How long is this Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings duo going to last in Tory ranks? I mean, they got rid of Thatcher. Surely Boris Johnson must have a time limit on his tenure if he continues to plummet.
You'd have thought so. The direct answer, Phil, to your question is, I think there's a high chance he'll be gone before the end of this year. Because I think he gives up, or Boris Johnson gives up on him, or the realization that he's doing the government harm. From a Labour tactical viewpoint, I think the answer I give, the longer he stays, the better.
Yes, quite.
Because as long as he's there, he's a drag on Boris Johnson's standing with the wider public. And you know, one of the things about the Dominic Cummings affair is that it's one of those issues, you can divide people's political views into two broad groups: positional views and valence views. Now, positional views are views about policy, about, you know, whether you think that health service should have more private involvement or less private involvement, whether taxes should go up or go down, whether the lockdown should be ended faster or more slowly. Those are positional views, right?
Yeah.
Valence views are about character. Do I trust this party or this leader? Are they competent? Are they on my side? How will they perform if the going gets tough? Will they keep their promises? Those kind of character judgments. Now, Phil, you and I, and if I'm honest, most of the people watching this discussion will have positional views, quite strong positional views on massive issues, right? You know, our politics involves a lot of positional attitudes. For most voters, they will have some positional views, but they're much more, but most people, and certainly the floating voters who decide the elections, they're valence voters. They basically decide on character. You know, when Margaret Thatcher was riding high, people thought, yeah, I don't know if I agree with her, but she knows what she's about. She knows where she's going. Tony Blair at his peak was a great valence victor. People back in '97, people trusted him to run the country properly. Well, what we're seeing now, the whole Dominic Cummings affair has been a valence catastrophe for Johnson. It has completely undermined his reputation and his party's reputations for things like trust and confidence. Hence those YouGov figures I was quoting a few minutes ago. They are as it were valence polling questions. And you know, Labour, the Conservatives are in great danger of losing the valence war. Labour has not yet won it. And again, that's what the poll shows. But the Conservatives are in deep valence doo-doo.
Very interesting.
And the longer Dominic Cummings stays there, the harder it will be for the Conservatives to get out of it.
Yeah, so the Labour Party has no objection to Cummings staying from a political standpoint in that regard, other than the damage he's doing to the country with his bogus thinking and policies and herd immunity nonsense. But we've seen a really interesting change, I think, also in Johnson at the dispatch box, because he seems to be revealed now as someone who has no real grasp on any detail at all. I mean, how is he going to be able to combat that?
And that's a very good question. This is why I just wonder how well he is, because I thought the last couple of Prime Minister's questions, he actually just looked quite rattled at the press conferences he's given. Now, we know that Boris Johnson has never been a details man.
Yes.
He's a big picture sunshine politician.
Yeah.
He wants to cheer us all up. When he was Mayor of London, he basically subcontracted all the detailed work, all the detailed policy making to people around him. And you know, I don't think he was that good a Mayor of London, but in as far as some things were achieved, it was because he found competent people around him to do it for him, while he sort of went around sprinkling stardust everywhere. And he's been, and this crisis has caught him out. But even so, I've been surprised at how weak he's been in the last few weeks, which just makes me wonder whether he has fully recovered from the dreadful disease which ended up in St Thomas's Hospital. He just doesn't look to me like a man on top of his game, even defining the game in his terms.
Of course. Well, of course, we wish him well in his recovery, but we want to beat him at the ballot box, not in the emergency room. Now, if you are from the Tory High Command side of things, well, I place you in that invidious position for a moment. what kind of leader do they have in their midst who could replace Johnson and challenge Starmer on detail?
It's a good question to which I think it's practically impossible to give an answer that will look anything but ridiculous in 5 years' time. Because if you look at Tory leaders, plainly the greatest Conservative leader of the last half century has been Margaret Thatcher. And yet until about 2 months before she became leader, she wasn't on anybody's list as a possible successor to Edward Heath. She came from nowhere. She was heavily patronised at the time she became Tory leader. She wasn't that highly rated in her first months in opposition. And yet as Prime Minister, whether we like it or not, she turned out to be incredibly effective. Tactically shrewd. She was in charge, was on top of the detail. She knew what she wanted to do, and she had the character and gathered around her the people to make the change happen. So with that warning, it may well be that the next Prime Minister, if we have a change of Prime Minister before the next election, now there's the next Prime Minister is a Tory, not Keir Starmer, it may well be somebody that is not on our list. All that said, the only one who seems to me to have improved their standing significantly in the last couple of months is Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Now, I'm not making a judgment on whether his furlough policies or so on are right or wrong. There's a separate issue. I'm just talking about his presentation. It's been clear, it's been competent, he sounded like a human being. He's been on top of the brief when answering questions at the press conferences. He's been done. He strikes me as an impressive leader. If I were Keir Starmer, he'd be the one I'd be frightened of. If Johnson fell under a bus or decided he was too ill to carry on.
Very interesting. And turning to Dominic Cummings for a minute, I mean, is he bright enough to exit in a timely manner? No. Or is it just ego-driven and it just hang on to the Titanic?
I mean, my impression is not a man I've never knowingly met him. If I met him by chance. I really don't. I know no more than what you and I have read of him and seen of him. But my impression is that he's a brilliant campaigner, and that's all. And the trouble is, governing is not like campaigning. He's treating governing as if it's a campaigning task. Let me give you one particular example. When you're running a campaign, you need to have almost dictatorial authority. He succeeded in the Brexit campaign partly because he just ran it ruthlessly. And there were some people around, people like Steve Baker, the Tory right-winger, who now hate him because he was sort of marginalised during the Brexit campaign. But that ruthlessness helped to deliver the Brexit referendum results. Equally, I think the Conservative election campaign in December was pretty ruthless. And again, I think Dominic Cummings deserves the credit, if credit is the right word, for the outcome. But today, that ruthlessness, what's happening is cabinet ministers are complaining that they're not being involved at all in the big discussions. Conservative MPs are grumbling that they have no access, effective access, to the Prime Minister. He's not listening to them. And their very real concerns to their constituents who are suffering from the crisis. So the extent to which Cummings is acting as if he's running a campaign, this is the wrong mode. Governing isn't the same. Governing needs to be more collegiate, more consultative, a bit slower, a bit more careful, a bit less arrogant. And he can't do any of that.
It's a fascinating answer. I agree with you. I think that he is clearly an excellent campaigner, having won the Vote Leave campaign and won the Johnson victory for the leadership of the Tory party. But I agree that he's making mistakes. Do you think it's conscious incompetence or unconscious incompetence, though, at this point? Because the Rose Garden episode was lamentable from any kind of PR standpoint. Does he lack the kind of awareness or self-awareness that's necessary, or is he just arrogant enough to believe he can get away with that flannel and push any old crap out there?
I think I'm tempted to say, spin doctor, heal thyself. Now, you know, I don't want to cause unnecessary upset, but Peter Mandelson, who I think has, you know, in recent years has become a very impressive, as a Labour Party elder statesman. Everything I've seen him say in the last 5 or 6 years, I've agreed with totally. But I think even he would admit that he was much better when he was Labour's Director of Communications at managing the talent around him. You know, it was through his work that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown achieved the prominence they did in the late 80s and early 90s. That was down to Mandelson. But when he became a politician and then a minister, he wasn't nearly as good at managing his own reputation. He couldn't seem to give himself the advice, the very good advice he was giving others. And I think Cummings is the same. I think if there were two Cummingses, the one who we never saw and the one we see, I think the one we never saw would say to the one we do say, you're making a complete mess of this, do it differently.
So it's time for him to retire into a late night slot on LBC and join Farage, his buddy on the airwaves, just ranting into the dark. Well, that would be a good outcome for that. Turning to the rest of what's happening after the coronavirus position starts to ease, and hopefully it will. How's the government handling that, do you think? And what's next for the economy? And how do we need to be thinking about that from a Labour policy perspective?
My goodness, I have no idea what the next few months will hold in terms of, you know, whether we'll get a second big, goodness knows, I hope not. And whether the economy will turn around. I mean, there's clearly, one of the big tests is going to be in the autumn when they ease down the furlough subsidies from the government and then drop them all together. Because if you're in, you know, if you're working for a pub, a restaurant, a hotel, if you're in the hospitality sector, if that is still not functioning or not functioning beyond sort of 10% of what it normally does, I would guess there's going to be a lot of redundancies. Hotels, airlines, we're yet to see whether the airlines get the summer holiday business back or how much of it they get back. So, you know, I think, I mean, the government, I think, and Rishi Sunak has done well so far in the money that's gone out to support companies and workers through a short-term problem. I'm not sure he has much alternative but to begin to wind it down through the autumn. But I wouldn't be surprised if either there has to be special help for the whole hospitality sector through to the winter, or you see a lot of redundancies there. But let me move on to the last part of your question, right? You know, where does Labour stand? Because in a sense, I think what Labour should be doing is almost irrespective of whether we have a V-shaped or a U-shaped recovery or an L and then a slow recovery, whatever. What I think has come out of this is there's now both a need, which arguably there's been for many years, but an appetite in the public, which there hasn't been, I believe, up to now, for really changing the way the country is run. This is a great progressive moment, because the problem the progressives have faced historically is that there are only essentially two ways you can win power and be effective in office as a radical government. Either because you ride a tide of popular demand for change. 1945 was the classic example. You know, out of the war, there was this huge demand for a welfare state, for the National Health Service, for pensions for all, better education system and so on, unemployment benefit. There was an appetite, Labour delivered this. So that's the first way the progressive hour comes about. The second is, if you like, by stealth. So you look at Tony Blair in 1997, the Labour manifesto was more notable for what it said it wouldn't do than what it did do. But it wasn't going to put up the standard rate of income tax. It wasn't going to put up the higher rate of income tax. It was going to stick to the Tory spending plan for the first 2 years. And then you get into power, if you like, through reassurance, and then you start gradually to be radical. And one of the tragedies of the whole Iraq thing is that obscures the fact that the Tony Blair government became incredibly radical and, in my view, very effective. So we did get the minimum wage, we did get health and education spending up, we did get freedom of information, we did get devolution, tax credits. You can go through a whole range of things, but you wouldn't have got much of a clue of that happening from the 1997 manifesto and campaign. It got into power and then did it. So to come back to your question, the next election, I think there will be an appetite for change, and Labour has got to both articulate that, lay out the radicalism, but persuade people that it is competent. It won't just throw money away. Now, the model I would suggest is, again, what happened in the Second World War? And I mean it in a very specific sense. In January 1941, a weekly picture magazine called Picture Post, a very popular sort of left of centre picture news magazine, in January 41, it produced an issue called A Plan for Britain. Britain was alone in the war. The Blitz was on. Everything looked pretty terrible. Everything looked pretty shaky. And it devoted a whole issue to saying, what are we fighting the war for? And it laid out what actually became, if you read it now, it became, if you like, the playbook for the Attlee government on pensions, on health, on education, on new towns, on green belts. I mean, it was, covered a whole wide range of things, saying we got to do better than we did in the 30s. And that's the discussion I think Labour ought now to be having. I think, so I'm not going to lay down, I don't think any of us can simply lay down, here's what you should do. I don't believe in the, if you like, the Paul Mason approach of, here are some half a dozen off-the-shelf left-wing policies that have always been there, now's the time to implement them. I think it's a more complicated process than this. And we ought to be discussing, with the unions, with business, with charities, with civil society, with the voters of the red wall seats in the Midlands and North that Labour lost. But I think the public are up to an honest conversation and up to radical ideas when that process is complete.
I think that's really insightful, and thank you for that, Pete. And a final thought and a final question I have for you. So Keir Starmer's making a good impression, I think, in terms of the political cognoscenti. But how does he take his character and capture the Valence voter in the wider market going forward? How's he going to break through just the Westminster media bubble into the general population to show his decency as a man and his excellence?
There's, Phil, you'll remember, I'm sure, and some viewers remember him, I'm right to sit around Joe Klein. He wrote a book anonymously, and it was later established that he was the author, called Primary Colours, and it was about how Bill Clinton became, effectively, how Bill Clinton became president of the United States. When he was in town a few years after that, when the vogue word was authenticity, what a politician needs is authenticity. And I said, does he agree with that? He said, actually, no, I'm not sure I do. Because, Bill Clinton faked authenticity. If you can fake authenticity, you're fine, but it doesn't necessarily persuade anybody. The quality that you can't fake is courage. So if I was to be impertinent enough to give Keir Starmer any advice, I think he, without going out of his way ridiculously, but there will be tests of him. They will come along in the next few months, a year or two, in which he will have a politically plausible, safe option and a riskier, more courageous option. And I suppose what I would say is when those moments come along, be prepared to take risks. It was interesting, a couple of days ago from when we were recording this discussion, the Prime Minister's question, when he made the point that he'd been backing the government on the pandemic when people in his own party, our own party, were not very happy to do that, and he took some risks. It was a very interesting moment because he said, look, I did take some risks. I think if he can come across as a man who is competent and a man who has courage, then he's halfway there. Then if he gets the policies and the economic and social strategy, then it's a very, very good chance that he'll lead Labour to victory at the next election.
Well, on that happy note, Peter, thank you very much for your time today, and we look forward to chatting to you again soon for your next review and update on all things political. Thank you for joining us.